We're living in a golden age in terms of the amount of research available to learn about the history of role-playing in general and Dungeons & Dragons specifically. I'm going to talk about some of those resources today on Daddy Rolled a One. Just wanted to give a quick note of thanks to all of you who helped support my Kickstarter for my book, Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions, which launched last Monday, June 3rd, and funded in the first 12 hours. Over this past weekend on June 8th and 9th, I surpassed my stretch goal, and now instead of getting just 4 pages of additional content, I've increased it to 8 additional pages. So that means that if you've contributed to the Kickstarter already, or if you get your pledge in before it ends on July 3rd, 2024, you're going to be getting 20% more content without an increase in price. So thank you again so much. I appreciate your support. And if you could please share my Kickstarter with anybody you know that are fans of fantasy adventure games, old school games like Old School Essentials, Labyrinth Lord, or 1981 Moldvay Basic D&D. It'll work with any of those really well as be very broadly compatible with any pre-3rd edition D&D style game. So thank you so much for your support again. Hello there, welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. So today we're going to be talking about the sheer amount of research that is out there to learn about the history of role-playing games. So I have a little collection here that I've put out. This isn't everything. And there's also like things I'm going to be showing copies of because, I've read them either or listened to the audiobooks or whatever, and I don't own them in physical media. But wanted to talk about that because I just, I find it fascinating. Obviously, it's a huge part of my channel here. And what I particularly love is this age that we're living in. There are just new discoveries happening all the time. So one of the ones that I just recently got is this book here. This is Blackmore Foundations, History, Maps, and Lore from 1971 to 1985. Early fantasy RPG works of David Arneson. And now this is the advanced uncorrected proof not for sale. I just got this in the mail literally today. Today's Monday, June 10th. And I was already going to be doing a video on history sources when this came in the mail. And so I haven't even gone all the way through this yet, but I wanted to show you guys because it's really cool that the folks over there, this was sent to me by the folks who put together this movie. And we're going to be talking about these later in the video. But they sent it to me because they know I cover this kind of content on my channel. So this is a brand new discovery. There's also some other books in here that are going to be new. And I wanted to talk about that because people have been writing about this, not quite since the very beginning, but close. So there's been stuff out there since, at least the early 80s, if not before. And when you consider that the game was founded in 1974, or at least that's when it was first published, that's pretty early on. I did want to call out that, some people have been talking about this in various formats, and one of my favorites is a blog called Zenopus Archives that is managed by a guy by the name of Zach Howard. And Zenopus Archives is like the preeminent source for learning about this edition of D&D. This is the Holmes Basic set from 1977. Obviously, it's not the set. This is the rule book. Now, I'm bringing this up because I just got my first copy of this rule book about maybe a month to 6 weeks ago. It's very, very new for me. I didn't grow up with this one. You guys know, you've seen before, I grew up with Moldvay Basic. So this was a new book for me to kind of dive into. I've had the PDF for a while, but I hate reading PDFs. So as you know from watching the channel, I'm very much into physical media. So I had gotten a copy of this. Now, getting this copy also coincided with me thinking of a topic for my video, which people have asked me to cover, which is the Warlock game that I covered in my last video that came out from the, players at Caltech. And I live, as you saw in that video, just a few blocks from Caltech. I walk by it every morning on my morning walk. And so I thought, well, that's very serendipitous that I just got this book. I want to talk about Warlock because, it's a topic that people have asked me a few times to cover, and because I live here. Well, one of the things I didn't remember, and this is totally on me, was that back in 2012, Zach wrote a series of articles well, at least started in 2012 on his blog, Zenopus Archives, about that very topic. And clearly that subject matter had gone into my subconscious, and I just hadn't thought about it forever. So when I started reading Warlock and then comparing it to this, I started making all these connections that came very, very easy. And that was partially because well, I'd say it's exclusively because I had read this on Zach's blog in the past. So my apologies for not crediting Zach and his work in that video. And I did want to point that out to make sure that he gets the credit that he's due. I'm going to put a link below to his blog where you can check it out. He's also done a conversion of the Tower of Zenopus, which is the example dungeon that's in this book. So that's where the name of his blog comes from. But he's done a 5e conversion for that for folks that are interested in 5e. And you can find that there, as well as some other content that he's done. I'm going to put links to that below. So thank you, Zach. And thanks for chatting with me on Twitter and Facebook and on my video about some of the things that I said and help providing some corrections. I really appreciate it. Okay, so one of the things that I found with studying this history, and I guess it's natural that this would happen, but as time goes on, it starts to get very, very difficult to kind of tease out the biases behind the person creating the content, writing the history, right? And, very specifically in Dungeons and Dragons, and this is why I put this in the thumbnail. I have a few different thumbnails. So if you saw a thumbnail that talked about like the Gygax versus Arneson, this is why I'm talking about this. Still to this day, 50 years later, people are still quibbling about who created what and when, and who should get, the credit for different things. And, I've had people come on the blog and kind of say, or not on my blog, onto my comments on YouTube and say that, looks like I have a Dave Arneson bias. And, they've been very polite about it, but they kind of said that. And I find that interesting because I did not grow up hearing that side of the story. So all of this stuff about Dave Arneson that I talk about has really only come in the last few years. And I'm sharing it not because I'm biased, but because I just feel like people haven't really talked about it before. And because of that, I think that, if you grow up hearing one side of the story, and I'm going to talk about where some of that comes from, but if you grow up hearing that, learning about the history of D&D and only hearing one side, I guess it could appear as biased when I'm pretty much so far only talking about the other side. And I'm not meaning to do that. I'm just trying to share what I've learned with people. And it seems that most folks haven't heard that stuff before, which is why I tend to focus on it rather than repeat something that they've already heard. Hopefully that makes sense. But I want to talk about some of these sources today. And if this is the kind of content that you like, what I try to do is delve into a subject and I'm not always trying to look at who created what or when, or who gets credit. What I like to do is try to figure out why. Why were the rules created in this particular way? So as an example of video, like why are there 6 ability scores and why was it those 6? Or a video on why does D&D use this style of magic that's like the fire and forget or Vancian magic? Why does it use that? How did that come about? So if that's the kind of content that you like, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel and hit notifications and make sure you select all. And then please share it with your friends and leave a comment. You guys know I love comments. So I would really appreciate it. So I'm going to kind of break down these different sources into sort of buckets that are sort of general, and a lot of them are going to overlap, but I thought it would be interesting to discuss them. And what I would love is for you guys, when you see something that really piques your interest and looks like something that you'd want to see more of, please leave a comment below and let me know that that's something that you would want to see a little bit more coverage of. And then what I'll try to do is collect those comments and then figure out if I can put a theme together. I like to have themed videos, not just flipping through books. So let me know and I'll do that. But what I want to start with, really, if you want to know the history of the game, some of the first things that you could start with are if you can get copies of them. And I think most of these you can get in PDF these days, but a copy of Chainmail would be a great thing to have to kind of look at some early stuff that influenced parts of the game. Now, of course, I've talked about this before, but the short version of how I heard D&D was created was that this game was created chainmail with the fantasy supplement in the back. And that Dave, and the way I heard it was Dave and Gary took that fantasy supplement and created a new game that was more role-playing versus miniatures. Now, of course, we know now that that history is overly simplified and quite incorrect in a few areas. So it's important to recognize that while still understanding that there are some parts of this that are very good to learn and to understand and educate ourselves on how elements from this impacted later games especially from TSR. Okay, so that's chainmail. But of course, also, and again, if you can get a copy of this, I got my copy of this. This is the original D&D Rules, the 3-volume box set. I got this copy from my mom as a birthday gift back in the late 90s. And I'm being quite honest, it was not on my radar. I didn't ask her for it. She got it because she went to the game store that I shopped at, which at the time was All-Star Games in Diamond Bar, unfortunately no longer there. And I had been going there often enough that the people at the store knew me. And so she went in on her own and asked them if they had a gift idea for me for my birthday. And they had just got this in and they said, sure, you should give him this. And she bought it for me. And had she not, I'm not sure that I would have a copy of this because I probably would have waited too long and it would have been way too expensive to acquire. So my mom's unfortunately passed away, but I always thank her for being so kind and thoughtful for having done this for me. But if you can get a copy of this, and again, you can get these in PDFs. Wizards of the Coast released a revised printing or whatever you want to call it, like a few years ago. And when I say revised, it was like different covers, but I think as far as I'm aware, the interior contents were the same. Okay, so, and I think you can get PDFs of the books if that's the only way that you can get them, these 3 books. But, using these to learn about the original rules of D&D and how they've just changed over time. So if you're new to the game, reading this will be fascinating to you in terms of learning about, like, first, how much is the same 6 ability scores, generating scores from 3 to 18, what the ability scores affect. Now, you won't see that too much in here because in here, the ability scores didn't really do a whole lot except affect your experience points. I've talked about that in previous videos. But like the traditional species or races, whatever you want to call them, that we're used to, like, dwarves, elves, and halflings are in here. The base classes are in here. All that kind of stuff, saving throws, hit points, armor class, all that kind of stuff is the same. Now, they're not always handled the same. Saving throws are handled differently now, but the concept of having that is in here. Okay. So, but then you also see how much is different, which is kind of the fun part. Okay. And then, if you can get the supplements, but, start, go small and start with what you can get. All right. So I think that's a great way to kind of start. Another thing that you can look at, a couple more things here. Dragon Magazine is a great history of the game. So this is my CD-ROM of the first 250 issues. There was a program that came in here for like how to read these. And I used to have it installed. Actually, at the time, I had it installed on my work computer because I didn't have a computer at home. But the individual files, they're just PDFs. And so I look at these as PDFs for the, I started subscribing with issue 90, and I have most issues from about 60 to 90. There's a few holes. But I'm pretty light on issues, 59 and lower. So this was a godsend to me. Again, a gift from my mom. But to read Dragon Magazine, because what you'll see in here, especially the early issues, this also has all of the strategic review on here. So you get to read those early articles and see the development of these different classes. But also, probably more importantly for understanding the history of D&D, are the articles, usually by Gary Gygax, where he writes about what he's working on, why he's working on it, how he develops certain contents and things like that. Now, you have to take it with a grain of salt. I've talked about that before because Gary changes his views over time on a variety of subjects, including how he came around, how he created the game. But again, just kind of seeing that change is worth in and of itself to look at that. Okay, so that's another thing you can look at. I was also lucky to acquire this at the start of the pandemic lockdowns. I've talked about this many times on the channel, but this is the first fantasy campaign by Dave Arneson. This is his notes for what his Blackmore campaign was. So We've looked at it before. I'm not going to open it because you guys have seen it, I think. If not, go back and look at the other videos. But also, I haven't necessarily just had an entire video dedicated to just this book. So if that is something that you want to see, let me know, and let me know how you'd like me to approach it. Do you just literally want a flip through page by page, or is there something else that you're looking for when I talk about this? But if you can get a copy of this, that's relatively expensive, and it's getting more so as more people become aware that it's out there. But if you can get a copy, I highly recommend checking it out. Again, just in terms of the development of the pre-existing stuff, looking at this and then looking at chainmail and then seeing what we got is kind of just that alone it could take, will take more than hours of time, but you'll be fascinated by how that all came together. Okay, so that's kind of some of that early stuff, but then we get into this concept of people writing about the game, or not just writing, because there's all kinds of content out there. There's blogs, as we talked about a little bit ago, but there's also, there are movies, documentaries, there are podcasts. Okay. So, there are people just sharing things on, on their, former creators that are sharing things on social media. And I'm going to talk about some of those as we go through this. And what I would like, because the thing is, I can't make this exhaustive. There's so much stuff out there. So if there are particular ones that I don't mention, make sure to drop those in the comments. If you could watch the whole video first before, just to make sure I didn't mention it, I would appreciate it. But I want to make sure I'm not forgetting one of your favorites as well. So, kind of like, let me know. But what I want to talk about right now are the ones that are purely about the history. So less commentary and less a look at the actual games that came out, because that is part of the history, but like the history of the game itself, Dungeons and Dragons. So I have a few here. There's many more, as I just mentioned, coming out later this year. I guess it's next month. Next month on June 18th, I think, is the release date of that Wizards of the Coast book. It's Dungeons and Dragons, the making of original D&D from 1970 to 1977. So the thing is a beast. It looks huge. I mean, when it looks huge, I mean, when you see it like on a shelf compared to other books, and it's full of tons of content. Now, one of the things that you're going to get in there is the reprints of all these original books from here, reprinted in that book. At least that's what I understand. So if you don't have this, and you don't have the funds to acquire it, which I would totally understand because they're like thousands of dollars now, you could grab that book and all of that's going to be in there plus more. And so one of the things that's they're talking about that's going to be in there is this like early draft of D&D, pre-publication draft, to see what that looked like before it got published. Now, I have seen another draft that I'm not allowed to share, unfortunately. The person who has the person who knows the provenance of that draft and where it came from is, I think not quite ready to kind of reveal that. And I totally respect that. But it was shared with me just so I could kind of look at it and kind of get a sense of, what those terms were like. And I'm very curious what this early draft is going to look like compared to what I have seen. Okay. So that's one thing. But there's tons more in that book. So I am going to pick it up eventually. So I haven't pre-ordered it yet. It is $99. So I'm and that's $99 on Amazon. So I'm just kind of waiting to see a little bit. Also, I just got a bunch of new stuff, as I just talked about. So I got plenty to go through right now, but that will eventually come into my collection. All right. But Wizards of the Coast has put out other books on the history of D&D, such as this one. This was in 2004, so 20 years ago, and this is the 30 Years of Adventure, a celebration of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I picked this up. One of my friends has an essay in here, which is kind of cool, but this was one of the first kind of like history books of D&D that I got, where I was learning history that wasn't just articles written in Dragon Magazine. And I was really excited about it, and it's a really neat book. It's got this kind of cool, I don't know what you call this. It's like this kind of almost translucent, as you can see, cover here. And then it's got this, like, I don't know if you can pick that up on the camera. It's like textured. I think it's supposed to be like dragon scales. That would be my guess, is what they were going for. This kind of really fun texture here. But now, again, published in 2004, my huge downside or problem with this book is that there is no table of contents. You just dive in. So you can't flip to a particular section because you don't know what it is or where it's going to start. Okay. But Forward by Vin Diesel. I think most of you by now know that he is a D&D player, and he's talked before about playing D&D to get inspired and get into character for some of his movie roles. Okay. And then an introduction here by Peter Archer. And then The Adventure Begins by Harold Johnson with Gary Gygax. So there's some great art in here. And then I'm not going to go through all of this, but I want to spend a little bit more time on this one because this is a book that nobody ever talks about. And it's one of my favorites. So it talks just a little bit about like, what's it called? How do you play my character? How's it played? How do you win? Things like this. And then like reprints of like, this is the character sheet for Borg the Fighter that was from the Moldvay Basic set that I started with. So that picture is very familiar to me, as is this one with the characters, I'll say discussing instead of arguing over how to split up the treasure. So that's really fun. White type on black with this red ink, not maybe the best choice as far as reading, and the type is very, very small, but still a great book. So then you see these little like kind of articles by, different people and like their experiences with the game. So this guy's the founder and owner of West Hollywood's Titmouse and Inc. Animation Studios, worked on such shows as Beavis and Butthead, The Osbournes, okay, blah, 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 right? And then using this cool art by probably my favorite artist from the 2E era, second edition era, late Wizards of the Coast, Tony DiTerlizzi. So I loved his work in the second edition Monstrous Manual. I've talked about that before. But he also is the guy who kind of made Planescape famous. He didn't make it famous, but he defined the look for Planescape. We'll put it that way. All right, so here you have this cool drawing of Gary and Dave. And I love that because it's so rare these days to have any kind of artwork where you see the two of them together. Okay, so I don't know if this was drawn from two different sources and then mashed together to make it look like they were standing right next to each other. But just seeing the two of these guys together, I think is cool. Okay, so this is called Where Did It Come From? And this is by Harold Johnson. And so he gives this summary here on the history, and there's holes in here, as well as there's some interesting dating that he puts in here, where he talks about how in 1968, Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin wrote Chainmail. Well, I think we all know that Chainmail was published first in 1971. This is a third printing, so I don't think the date is on there. Yeah, third edition, seventh printing from 79. But I believe the first printing was from 71. The third edition itself is from 75. So anyway, I mean, it's a small quibble, but just the idea that like some of those dates seem a little off. And then he talks about Dave Arneson creating Blackmore between 1969 and 1972. So I think that is true, but those dates are also disputed. A lot of people say it didn't start until 71. Other people say it was 70. Other people obviously say 69. So this is pretty early on for him to be claiming that it began in 1969. And there are a lot of people that will argue and say that's too early. I'm not one of them because I wasn't there. So the best we can do is take the sources that we have. I've talked about this before, some of whom are first-person sources of people who are actually there, and rely on their memory that they can remember a specific date that happened 50 plus years ago and imagine that they don't make mistakes. And then any written documentation that we can find. So it's very difficult to kind of pin that down. But anyway, he writes this. It's cool. You've got all this art in here. So again, this is the set that I started with. I talk about that all the time. Moldvay Basic. Here's that Holmes Basic book that we talked about, the Rule Cyclopedia, all the basic sets. Okay, so then you have a section here on Gen Con. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I wanted to point out something specific that's cool in here. Stephen Colbert. Okay, so The Birth of D&D by Gary Gygax. So Gary Gygax writes this essay in here about how D&D got started. Okay, I won't read it now, But what's interesting, so it goes on for a few pages here. He does not mention Dave Arneson one time in this article. Not a single time does Dave Arneson's name come up. I think that's interesting. Also, at the time that this was written, this is 2004, Dave Arneson was still alive. I mean, obviously, Gary was too. Now, Gary's going to die in 2008, so about 4 years after this was written and published. And then Dave Arneson's going to follow a year after in 2009. But both of them were alive, and only one of them is included in this book. I'm not sure why that is, but it is, it is what it is. And Will Wheaton's kind of article there. Okay, and then an article here by Steve Winter. So I mentioned before I was the judge with Steve Winter. The first time I was asked to be a judge for the one-page dungeon contest, Steve Winter was also a judge, and I just thought that I was like over the moon. Okay, but so anyway, and then it goes into all these different campaign settings. So Dragonlands and Greyhawk and the Forgotten Realms, this is really cool stuff because you hear a little bit about where these came from, but like in these short little essays. Mystara, or what I prefer to call the Known World, Spelljammer. Okay, you can see all that here. Ravenloft, Dark Sun, all the 2E settings. 2E was very setting happy. Planescape, we just chatted about that. Okay. And then you get into second edition, and there's cool things in here too. And one of my favorites as you get in here is there's a section on the Player's Handbook reference books, all those brown cover books, which I have a ton of. I have most of them. I don't have all of them, but I have most of them. But then my favorite 2E product, one of my favorites, were these historical green source books. I love these. And I love that there's an article in here just about them because, again, it's something that nobody ever talks about anymore. So some more great art. Jenny Tartakovsky, Samurai Jack, one of my favorite animated specials, or animated series, I should say. So, and then again, it just keeps going through all these different editions. And, I guess it's relatively in order in terms of how they came out. And remember, this was published 20 years ago. So this is finishing in 2004. And this is like after 3.5 has just come out. 3.5 comes out in 2003. So this is even before 4th edition comes out. Now, to my knowledge, I don't think Wizards of the Coast put out a history book for the 40th anniversary. I should have looked from in my video, but I didn't. But anyway, this is a cool book. If you can find this anywhere, I highly recommend it. All right, so to keep talking about some of the books that are really about the history, specifically about Dungeons and Dragons. So this book came out in 2022. This is by Ben Riggs, Slaying the Dragon. Now, this is an interesting one because it really is focusing on the last years of Gary Gygax at TSR, and then how Lorraine Williams took over after she kind of, helped force his decision to leave the company. And it really gives kind of a different perspective. So, I grew up, I say grew up, like the story that I had heard is like Lorraine Williams is some evil, terrible person that ruined the company and hated gamers and forced Gary Gygax out and all of that. And of course, thing is, these are all people that we're talking about. I know that sounds a stupid thing to say, but she's a person. I'm sure she made decisions that she thought were correct. I don't know her at all, so I have no dog in this fight. But one of the things that I read in this book that really kind of helped me understand that, it's people, so it's complicated. It's never black and white. Okay, I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make. So my friend he's a friend from Twitter, and it's William W. Connors. I've talked about him before, but he was a designer at TSR, worked a lot on the Ravenloft line. He did some work on the Beckme line, at least one of the Gazetteers. No, more than one. And he's a really nice guy. And he had mentioned to me this story before, but then I read it in here, which is that his wife was very, very sick at the time, and she needed a lot of medical work done. And so Bill went to Lorraine and basically said, like, I need to resign because I can't fulfill my duties and I need to take care of my wife. And she's like, absolutely not. You're on extended leave for as long as you need to take care of your wife, and I will pay your salary so that you have medical insurance, essentially. And I think there was more to it than that. But the fact that, like, this woman that I had heard is nothing but like the Wicked Witch of the West, essentially, did something like this that is such a kind act of generosity, which is essentially to pay someone's salary for like months, I think even longer, when he wasn't actually doing any work for them, so that he could continue to take care of his wife, who was extremely ill. That really paints a different picture of a person. And like I said, people are complicated. Now, bad people can do good things once in a while. Everyone, it's not, like I said, it's never black and white, but, I do think that kind of helps put a different perspective. So anyway, this is a good book. I would recommend it if you have the means of picking that up. Now, another book that's come out very, very recently. This is just this year, I think it's 2024. It might be late 2023. I'm pretty sure it's 2024. But this is 50 Years of Dungeons and Dragons. So I picked this one up. I got it last week. I ordered it from my local bookstore just to support them. And one of the things that's in here that is really cool, well, there's a ton of cool things in here. So I like the way that they split it up, because they have these different sections. So one of them is more kind of history based, but then they have other sections that kind of talk about, like kind of the I don't know, psychology, I guess, sort of like how D&D can be used, in other studies other than just studying its history. So like, classrooms and dragons, learning from Dungeons and Dragons, and forging family through queer Dungeons and Dragons, critically playing Dungeons. So a lot of really cool things, just the way that they kind of split it up into these different documents. So I wanted to point out here that on page 63, so there's a whole section in here by Zach Howard. I just mentioned him earlier, and Tony Rowe. I think it's Rowe. It could be Rao, and I apologize if I pronounce your name incorrectly. But Dr. Holmes, I presume, how a California neurology professor penned the first Dungeons and Dragons basic set. So this was a great read. It's actually, I read this out of order. This was the first thing that I read when I got the book. And that's partly because I've been talking with Zach about this after my last video, and I wanted to kind of see that. So I actually haven't even finished reading this yet. And so this is one of the ones where, like, I want to read more of it and then kind of give you guys an overview of what's in the book. But there's just some really interesting, cool things in here. So again, I haven't gone all the way through it where I could give you like a definitive sort of like, what are the key parts. But from what I've seen and from as far as I've gotten so far, there's a lot of really cool stuff in here. And so it's part history, but again, also like part sort of from some people, sort of these reflections on using Dungeons and Dragons to help explore different areas of your life, using it as a classroom teaching tool as an example. And so I think that's kind of neat how a game like this, exploring the different facets of the game rather than just talking about how it was created. So definitely recommend this. Try to pick that up. Okay, so obviously kind of the king of D&D history to date, at least, would be John Peterson. So he has his whole suite of books. The first one was Playing at the World. So I'd been reading the blog, and then Playing at the World came out. So I actually don't own it in hard copy. Unfortunately, I have read it. I just don't have the hard copy. However, there is a revised version of Playing at the World coming out, I think, very, very soon. And it's actually split into two different parts. So there's like a part 1 and a part 2. So definitely check that out because the problem with Playing at the World is it was printed in such small quantities that used copies now are like hundreds and hundreds of dollars. It's kind of ridiculous how expensive they are. But it is going to be cool when the revised version comes out, because I think there's going to be more, there's additional content to the fact that, they're printing it into two separate printings. And so it will finally be at a reasonable price again. But he has a whole series, John Peterson does. So after Playing at the World, you have, I'm not doing these in order, but you've got like the Elusive Shift, and then you have the Game Wizards. So very good, detailed history of role-playing games told from, a certain perspective. And again, I think it's very, very difficult try as hard as we want. It is difficult to avoid putting bias into works, and that bias might not even be intentional. It could just come from the people that are being interviewed, are being talked to, and what their perspectives are. And so, and I'm not pointing at John Peterson specifically. I mean, he's way more of an academic than I will ever be, and has access to a lot of stuff that I will never have access to, like at least, in person. And has a very good approach. So that's not what I'm saying, but what I am trying to say is that it's important as we're doing these things to remember that there is, everybody, whether they want to admit it or not, has sort of a built-in, I think, bias, and it's very hard to get away from it. And the bias I'm speaking of very specifically is the amount of contributions from Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. And there's still, to this day, like I said, 50 years later, people who don't agree on this. And I like to seek out sources that are balanced, or try to be balanced, and where you'll get people talking about both creators. So, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit here when I get to these two things very specifically, which I think is kind of cool. And one of the reasons why I enjoyed both of these. Okay, but again, you've got those history books. Okay, so but something else that you have are things like a podcast, right? So I mentioned podcasts earlier. So one of the ones that's come out, it started actually in 2022, but then they just started dropping new episodes recently. It's by Paul Stormberg is the main guy, and then there's like a podcast, like a documentary creator guy. I forget exactly what his role is. I know his first name, I want to say, is Art, and I just forgot his last name. But Paul Stormberg runs the Collector's Trove, where he has access to a lot of we would call them artifacts, like, vintage role-playing game stuff from people who were there at the beginning. And he has been able to do like these auctions where he'll put things up for auction. And it's stuff that you will never find like on eBay, because these are things like, a personal handwritten letter from so-and-so to so-and-so about such and so, right? Like things like that. It's like super cool stuff like that. But also things like Gary Gygax's personal collection of, whether it was adventures or whatever, and you get a certificate of authenticity that it belonged to the person, right? So, but anyway, Paul is creating this podcast called When We Were Wizards, and really in depth. It does focus on Gary Gygax, and it says that right up front. It says that it's talking about the two creators, but it's either in the introduction or in the very first episode. I forget which one, but it specifically says that it is going to focus on Gary Gygax. So you're getting the story from a Gygax point of view. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, even if you're reporting that history like that, what someone might take from that is that Gary Gygax was more important than Dave. And if there's anything I'm trying to do on this channel, it's to show that they are both important, and that, in fact, there are other people that we never even talk about that are important as well to getting to the point of playing these games and enjoying this hobby that we all love. Okay, so but definitely check out that podcast. Episodes are kind of long; they're like 40 minutes. But if you watch my channel, that's a breeze. You should be okay with that. But then I kind of want to talk about some other types of, like, history. I don't know why I'm using quotes. It is history. It's history of the game, but these ones sort of focus on the history of the genre of role-playing games. So one of the earliest ones that I got was this, Heroic Worlds, A History and Guide to Role-Playing Games by Lawrence Schick. I talked about this in my last video. I've talked about this book before, but it basically breaks down role-playing games into different genres: comic book, superheroes, espionage, fantasy, ancient world, fantasy Arthurian, blah, 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 right? So horror, humor, military, mystery, and crime. And it breaks these down, and then it talks about these different games and sort of like who the main players were when these games were published. It covers games as well as adventures. And then every once in a while, there'll be like a little... something like this where it's by like, it's like a little synopsis about a particular person and their involvement in creating things. So it's not a biography. It's like little, historic. I don't know how to describe it. It's like, people talking about their experiences with the game. Okay, so you see very different creators here that we're all familiar with those names. Okay, so now when I picked this up, it was published in, I want to say, 83. You can kind of tell just by looking at the layout. The layout's not the best by modern standards. It could be a little bit easier to read. It's kind of all smashed together. I picked it up, years and years later, and already when I picked it up, it was kind of pricey for what it is. So I think it's a little bit, I haven't looked recently to see how hard this is to find. Okay, my apologies. It came out in 91. I could have sworn it was 83. But in any event, I didn't get it until the 2000s. And like I said, I paid more than cover price for it. But definitely check this out if you can get access. And of course, Lawrence Schick was one of the guys that was right there from the beginning. Well, not from the beginning, but very, very close. So highly recommend that. Now, probably my favorite series as far as like specific games is Designers and Dragons. This is a 4-volume set by Shannon Appelkline. I helped kickstart this back in, I think, 2014. It might have been, not exactly that year, but around there, right? But this is a series, and then there's a supplement called the Platinum Appendix that covers things that aren't in these. But each book is a different decade. So the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then basically 2000 to 2009. Okay. Oh, lost my bookmark. Each book has a bookmark. So, but these go through and talk about like the different companies that began publishing in that decade. And so like TSR is, of course, covered in this first book, and it takes up a huge section because it covers the entire history of TSR all the way up through the 90s, even though this is the 70s book because they began publishing in the 70s. So similar like Flying Buffalo. So at the time, Flying Buffalo was still active. So this is covering the entirety of that chapter. But you can just see look how short the Flying Buffalo chapter is compared to how long the TSR section. So this is Flying Buffalo and this is TSR. But you've got Games Workshop in here and Game Designers Workshop, and you have who's this one? Judges Guild. So it's just so cool. Like just the detail in here is really, really great. And so again, if that's something that you can find and pick up, I think it might have been republished on like a revised edition. So you might be able to find it that way, but definitely see if you can seek those out if you're interested at all. And kind of like, again, it kind of lists like all the products. I wouldn't say it goes into as much product detail as this does, but this is one book for everything. And you saw how that was 4 books. So you can see the change in detail. These books tend to focus more on, the creators themselves and founding of the companies, who founded the company, why it was founded. If it's folded, like it will get into like what happened to make that company like go out of business. Whereas this one will specifically talk about like this adventure was released at this time. And here's a quick summary, like a 1-sentence summary of what that adventure is about, that kind of thing, right? To give you a sense of how different those books are. But there's a lot of books like that. So we just talked about Eric Holmes, who had edited the 1977 basic rule book, that blue book. He wrote a book. Okay, his is from 83. That's why I had 83 in my head. He wrote a book in 1983 called Fantasy Role Playing Games. So similar, trying to track all these different games that were out there and what, summarizing them, like what they were about. So that's out there. Recently, you have and I don't have this yet, unfortunately. It's been on my list for a while to get, and I haven't picked it up yet. But it's Monsters, Aliens, and Holes in the Ground by Stu. I think it's Horvath. If I got your name wrong, I'm sorry. I will put a correction up here on the slide. But he talks about like all these different games, kind of more, I'd say more in line like this, but a little bit more detail in this nice giant hardcover book. Talking about all these different games, kind of like, and again, in different genres, different styles of games, of role-playing games. So if you're kind of into like less about the history of these companies being founded and more about the specific products or the specific product lines, you kind of want to check those out. Okay. So we talked about that. Then there's a whole series of books, and I kind of alluded to it earlier when I was talking about this book here. There's a whole like studies that are done in kind of like the impact of Dungeons and Dragons and role playing in general on various types of educational studies, and like how they impact people's lives. So it's less about the history of the games but more about the impact of the game. So I don't talk about that a lot on the channel, so I'm not going to focus on that too much, but there's a ton of books out there like that. I guess, sort of this education or psychology aspect. There's the functions of role-playing games. There's role-playing games and psychotherapy, all kinds of stuff like that. So there's a category of books out there if that's a topic that interests you. Okay, so then there's art, of course. So we've got this giant book here by Wizards of the Coast. To date, probably my favorite Wizards of the Coast product, which is Art and Arcana, A Visual History. So while this is about art, there's really cool stuff in here that does help explain the history of the game. And it includes things like, newspaper articles, reprints, or here's all the cartoons. They talk to each artist and ask them what their favorite piece of artwork was that they did, and then the artist will point that out. It's funny that Darlene says that this is her favorite because I always like this one. I mean, look at the detail on that. It's amazing. Not that I don't like this, but this is so cool. It goes through that. It has ads, which I think is really neat. It shows you all the different, adventures and what the original covers looked like. But then it also has things like, reprints of like letters. Okay, things like that you never would have seen before. And why would you see that, right? So there's things in here in the very early section where there's notes from Gary Gygax to the artists, like, can you draw this? This is the whole section on demons and what the different demon types are. But there's sections where you see Gary Gygax's handwritten notes that get like returned on a piece of artwork and says, can you change this? Can you do that? Like, that's super cool. And it's part of the history of the game. So if you're in the art, definitely, this should be in your collection, that you can refer back to and just look at the evolution of the art over time. They do think cool. This is one of my favorite parts of the book too, where they talk about like different monsters. And then they show you like, this is the original appearance of the monster and what it was. And so that's original D&D, but then there's first edition, second edition, Tony D. Terlizzi, third edition, fourth edition, and fifth edition. And they just show you how it's changed over time. So that's super cool. So I'm a big, big fan of this book. My friend Wes Allen at DM Tales did a whole video review of this, so you could check that out if you're interested. But I highly recommend that. But I even have some older books of art. So this is the Art of Dragon magazine. So different covers and interior art. And I love it because right at the beginning, this is the second issue of Dragon that I ever got. I've talked about that before. It's the issue that had the Cavalier number 72. But I love this just to get it covers of Dragon. Like, and it's not just the covers, like I said, it's also interior art. But I think that this is really cool. It reprints some of the stories that were in there as well. And then there's this whole section in here for building Great Stony, which was a big, at the time, like insert in Dragon. And it's like so hard to find magazines that have this insert anymore. So you get it in there. So again, this is long out of print, but let's see when this was published. 1988. You might be able to find a used copy somewhere, but that's a really fun book as well. And then the Art of Dungeons and Dragons fantasy game. So this came out, I think, around the same time. Earlier, 1985. So this is just all the different stuff and they break it up into like dragons, and funny that there's that cover again. So there's a section on dragons, and then, there'll be a section on, fighters and dwarves and all that kind of stuff. And they break it up that way and just show different art. So these are really fun. Definitely nowhere near as detailed as this is. This again has more history. It is an art history, but it's much more visual. This actually has stories about where the art came from. So definitely recommend that. There's also a documentary that you can find. It's called Eye of the Beholder, which is a hilarious pun name. I saw it on Amazon years ago, Amazon Prime. I don't know if it's still there. I'll put a link to where it is now. But a great documentary about the artists at TSR. So highly recommend seeking that out if you can find it. And then just as an example, a lot of these artists, are active on social media. So as an example, right now, I talked earlier about the Tony DiTerlizzi art from the Monstrous Manual, second edition, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So on his Facebook page, he is sharing his artwork from the Monstrous Manual that he did. He mainly did the humanoids. So like Medusa, Mind Flayer, orcs, bugbears, all those. He might not have done the bugbear, but like Knoll, like I said, the Mind Flayer, all those types of creatures. And that's my favorite art from that book. But he's doing the series now because it's like it's now I guess it's the 31st anniversary of that book being published. I believe the Monstrous Manual came out in 93. I know the Monstrous Compendium came out in 89, but I think the Monstrous Manual came out in 93. But in any event, he's doing this series where he talks about how he got to do the drawing, the illustration, the way that he did, like those decisions that he made and like the different sketches and iterations that he did before he got there. So you can see history right there, like on social media. He's putting that like on his Facebook page. So that's really cool. I also just said in any event, and I remember in my last video, I must have said it about 8 to 9 times, and I actually put out a little note and I said, let's play a game, like count how many times I say it. And nobody has played yet. So I guess people were listening to that one and not watching because there was a little note on there to count that. Because I guess that's my fill-in phrase when I'm stumbling over what things to say. Instead of saying I say in any event, which is a new thing. I never used to do that. So that is the kind of the art standpoint. Okay. Then you have a whole series of books that are sort of more like just personal reflections of playing the game, what people, their memories, their almost memoirs of playing the game. So the first one I ever read was Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks. This came out in 2009, I want to say. Ethan Gilsdorf. So that's a photo of him as a young man. So like I said, 2009, let's just double check that. Why am I not seeing it there? I know it's on here somewhere. Yeah, it's 2009 right there. So one of the things that's really interesting at this, if you see this, he writes for or has written for, I thought it said it on the back here, but for Psychology Today. Oh, yeah, right there. Psychology Today. You know who else wrote for Psychology Today? Eric Holmes, who edited the 1977 basic Dungeons and Dragons edition of the game. He was a neuroscientist, and so he used to write for Psychology Today. So kind of like a full circle thing. But this book kind of just covers, like I said, it's a personal memoir of like growing up at the time and playing these games. But he doesn't just cover D&D. He covers all kinds of things, Renaissance fairs and other stuff like that. But definitely it's a fun kind of book if you grew up during that time in the 70s and 80s and you remember what it was like. This will definitely give you some nostalgia for growing up during that time and kind of all the different kinds of things that you might have been into during that time period. Okay, another one very similar, The Elfish Gene. So Dungeons, Dragons, and Growing Up Strange. So I did enjoy this a lot. I think this is 2014, so it's a little bit later. And no, 2007, actually earlier. That's interesting. I could have sworn it was later. One of the things that I noticed in this book, though, and I think it might just be me, but as I read through this, one of the things that I kind of noticed was I got the impression that this kid was, the author, kind of bullied a little bit because of his interest in Dungeons and Dragons and, as he says, growing up strange. And I think that he still has some feelings about that, and rightly so, but to me, it came through in the writing, where I got the impression that he was kind of still a little sore about it. And I actually mentioned that in Twitter when I talked about having read this book, and he jumped on and kind of got a little defensive, and I felt bad because I wasn't trying to attack him. So, but it's an enjoyable read. I would highly recommend checking this out. Again, if you grew up during that time. So this isn't going to really give you as much a history of the game. There's a little bit. Both of these have some history, but they're more about like personal reflections of what it was like to be playing those games at the time, as opposed to like how those games came about and who created them. But, it's always good to have a personal perspective, I think, in a study like this, so it doesn't become too academic, because these are games and they should be fun. Now, this one, maybe this is the one that's from 2014. I'm getting my dates mixed up here. of Dice and Men. I was a fan of this, 2013. This is like part history, part personal reflection. So one of the kind of the premise of this book, as I remembered, I read this a long time ago, is the author is kind of like, he played the games back in the day. And so he's writing about how the games that he played came about, but he also is playing in a new game, a new role-playing game. And so he kind of goes back and forth talking about the history and then his personal kind of perspective of like starting playing again after like all this time of like having not played. So it was really cool. It's really well written. He's a very good writer. And again, I liked it. And, you know, there's history in here. So, you know, if you're looking for something that's not like, something like Planet the World is so good because it is so detailed. But as far as like reading, and again, this is not a slam because it's just the way that it's done. It's a little dry. And something like this is, you know, maybe not as academically, I don't want to say correct, but like, you know, it's not an academic book, but it's written to be a little bit more accessible for somebody who's maybe not like a student or professor trying to learn this kind of stuff. So definitely check that one out as well. So this kind of like bridges the gap between like the history and then like these sort of personal reflections. And now we're going to discuss sort of the last branch of this type of history that I'm talking about. And it's really kind of two branches. It forks because this branch is really talking about the creators. And, you know, while there are a lot of creators and there's some work out there talking about, you know, various people, the two main branches here are discussing the two co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons. So Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. So those are where the two kind of focus. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit and sort of share some of the work that's out there that kind of delves into these people. And, you know, I'm specifically focusing on the works where it's talking about their role in the creation and the history of Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, so what that role was, what they did. So there's a few different places you can start. I'm not sure that you want to start here, but one that's going to talk about both of them pretty in depth is you can actually find online a copy of the lawsuit of David L. Arneson versus Gary Gygax and TSR Hobbies, Inc. So that's online. It's like 852 pages or 854. It's very long. It's very dry. It's very legalese, of course, but it goes into the details of, you know, what Dave Arneson's, you know, case was, what his complaints were, what he was saying had happened and why he was suing them. And then it gets into the response by Gary Gygax and his legal team as to, you know, their reaction and then sort of their counterclaims. And so, you know, again, I don't know that I would start there, but I do think it's an important part of the history to just be aware of and kind of look at that. It's, you know, it is part of Dungeons and Dragons history. This D&D throughout its history has had a long, not always pleasant dealings with lawsuits, whether they're being sued or put under injunction by people for violating copyright. You know, whether it's with Tolkien or with other things. They had a little kerfuffle over the the Deities and Demigods book by including the Cthulhu and Melnibonéan mythos, even though they technically had the rights to do it. There was some bad blood there for a while with Chaosium, where they had to kind of figure that out. So, and then in the 90s, you have them suing other people. It might have even started in the 80s, but I remember it very specifically in the 90s, where you had people like putting, you know, campaign websites up for the first time to talk about their campaign, and TSR cracking down on them for sharing content, you know, related to mechanics and things like that. And then you have, you know, the biggie here, which is, of course, you know, Arneson versus Gygax and TSR Hobbies. So you can go through that. I've read it. Well, I haven't read it all the way through. Again, I'm not a lawyer. So, and a lot of it is just things like, we agree that we'll meet the next time on this particular day. And so it's like, you just skim past that stuff. But the meat of it is Arneson providing a case of what he created and that he wasn't getting royalties for his creations, and then showing examples and talking about dates of when things were submitted. And so this is where you get into situations where The legal documents end up becoming, quote unquote, the truth, even though they're not maybe entirely accurate, and you're making concessions in order to, get out of court. So this case was settled through, like payments being made and adjustments being done. And so in order to get to that conclusion where everybody could just get out of this and move on with their lives, stipulations were made that, again, weren't always necessarily correct. So I've had people tell me, like, we know exactly what Dave Arneson's role was in creating D&D because it's in these court documents. Well, and again, I talked about this before, but there are court documents that describe the Monster Manual 2, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Monster Manual 2 from 1983, as being a revision of Monster Manual 1. It's not a revision. It's an entirely separate book. It happens to share the same name. It is a book of monsters, but it doesn't revise anything that was in the original Monster Manual. But if you look at the court cases and don't know anything about the game or its history, you would look at that court case and say, yep, the court says that Monster Manual 2 is a revision, so that's what it is. So I just use that as an example to point out that these court documents, this lawsuit, it's educational, but it's not going to get direct answers to questions that we might have. It's going to be, I'd say, it's kind of, it can lead you in a direction. It's what in my line of work we would call it directional, but it's not actual. All right, but in any event, so yeah, I just did it again. So you have that, but I find it more pleasant to look at things that just dive into specific creators. I'm actually going to start with Gary Gygax here. So there are a lot of books about him. So one is Empire of the Imagination, which I've read, and I must have let someone borrow it because I scoured my shelves today looking for it and I couldn't find it. It's possible that I misplaced it, set it aside, or like I said, lent it to somebody. But this is one of the biggies that talks, about Gary Gygax, and I would recommend. I mean, I'm recommending pretty much all of these. There's none of these. I'm not showing you anything, obviously, that I don't personally own or that I haven't read. So I would definitely recommend that. But this was a fun one for me too. I really liked this one. Gary Gygax and the Creation of D&D: Rise of the Dungeon Master. So he said it's written here by David Kushner, and then it says illustrated by Corinne Shadmi. So I got this as a gift, and I had just seen it, like the title listed, and I had put it on a list. And then it turns out it's a graphic novel. It's a comic book. And I actually didn't know that when I got this, and I was pleasantly surprised. I loved this because if you've watched any of my shorts, or if you follow me on social media, particularly on Twitter and Instagram, I'm a comic book guy. And so I dug that this was basically a biography of Gary Gygax told with, in comic book format and as a graphic novel. And the drawings are fun. They're I don't want to say they're cartoony because that makes it sound like they're amateurs. That's not what I mean. They're fun. It is very well illustrated, but I just, I dig graphic storytelling. So I think it's a medium that doesn't necessarily always get its due. So that's our friend Dave Arneson right there. So there's that. Now I just got this a couple weeks ago, maybe not even 2 weeks, but The Dreams in Gary's Basement. So this was, I think, a crowdfunded movie, and for some reason it wasn't on my radar. I missed it, and I don't know how I missed it. So I had to buy it after the fact. I ordered it directly from them, which you can do now as well, that the Kickstarter has been fulfilled. But and I think it's available on streaming, but I just, like I said, I like physical media. Now I know that I don't have to search it up every time I want to watch it. I just pop it in the player. So this is really neat. That somebody made these miniatures for Gary and then put them in a little setting that looked kind of like his office at the time. So they talk about that in here. So this is, basically it is a biography of Gary Gygax primarily, but it does discuss, again, in the context of the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. And so, and interviewing people who were there at the time. So there's lots of interviews and this from people that, were associates of Gary. Tim Kask is in here. Actually, Lee Gold, we've talked about her before with her Alarms and Excursions zine. She's in here. Just tons of people. I'm not going to name them all. But one of the things that I like in this, and it's going to lead into something I'm going to talk about in a second, is they do discuss the relationship between Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, how they came together. You saw that in this book as well. Okay, so coming together, creating the game, and they actually one of the things that's interesting is they tried to the people that put this together, like they questioned when they're interviewing some of the people, they asked them, like, do you want to talk about like the lawsuit between Dave and Gary? And they're kind of like, no, I don't choose to talk about that. And they just kind of move on. And they talk in here about how they showed this to essentially, I think it was like at least like a subset of, the Blackmore bunch, the Minneapolis gang, to show them how they discussed the relationship between Gary and Dave and their involvement in the creation of D&D and what they did and their role in that. And according to this, they say that like the people that saw that thought that this was very, complimentary, or at least it wasn't diminishing Dave's role. And I think that that's a concern when you start getting into there, like these two camps. It's just crazy. It's been 50 years and people are still fighting about who did more and who deserves most of the credit. And I think that I would love if people are maybe kind of getting tired of that. And instead of being negative, let's talk about like what they built together. And so in this video, in this movie, this documentary, they do address this, and that people felt that it was done in good taste, and that it talks about that relationship. So that's in here, and that comes up in here as well. So this is probably the first, other than reading blogs, particularly Grognardia, where James Mela, and I always say James Malacheski because that's how I think it's pronounced, but I've never heard it pronounced out loud. But his Grognardia blog was kind of what drew me back into rediscovering old school D&D. But aside from his blog, and I discovered other blogs outside of that, which we've talked about before. This was like one of the first things. So I'd read Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks, and I guess I'd probably read these three books right here. Those would be the big ones. I had ordered Designers and Dragons, but this is one of the first things where I didn't really know much about Kriegspiel and Strategos and Strategos N and Dave Wesley's Braunstein and Brownstone. I didn't know all that, or if I had, it was sort of like very cursory level. And so watching this, and I'm not a film critic, but I thought it was well done. I thought that, from the production value for being something that was also crowdfunded, I thought that this was, something that was enjoyable for me to watch. I've watched it before. I've watched it at least 3 times. Plus once at the convention back in April when I went to DaveCon. And my wife has walked in on me watching this. And, she plays in my D&D game, but I think she does it out of respect because she knows how much time I put into it, like my long-running one. She doesn't play in the one I run for my daughter. But she's walked in on me before while I've been watching this, and she's kind of sat and kind of got sucked in and started kind of asking questions and things like that. And which I think is kind of cool. So I really recommend this. Now, I know there are some people that think that both of these 2 movies are biased, that this is way biased for Gary and this is way biased for Dave. Well, I think that's partly natural because this is talking about Gary Gygax. This isn't talking about how Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson created D&D. It's talking about how Gary created it, what his role was. And then this is talking about sort of the foundations of what came before to get Dave Arneson to create Blackmore, which is how you then end up with D&D. And so, of course, it's biased, but this one also discusses the relationship between Dave and Gary. And they even talk in here about, they couldn't have created what they did had they not gotten along, had they not been friends. Obviously, they had a falling out later. There's the lawsuit. I don't think the lawsuit was personal. I think it was very much business. Dave Arneson felt that he wasn't being credited with what he had done, and he wanted to reap some of the rewards that had happened. So I don't think it was a revenge thing or anything like that. But they do talk in here about how the two of them had to have been friends. They were friends because they worked together to create this. So, which I like that. I think it's a refreshing look, and it's just a reminder that people, as I said, are flawed, and they're people, and they're not one dimensional. Okay. The other thing I really liked about this as well is that Dave Arneson's daughter, I think it's Malia. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing her name, but she is in here as well. And when she was older, she played with the Blackmore gang, but she talks about like her dad in here. And it's just a really nice reminder that while we look at these guys as like from a distance and think of them as like, I don't know what the right term is, but like they're people. These are individuals that had families that, were trying to pay the bills and raise, like I said, raise a family and have friendships and things like that. And it's something that I think is a good reminder. And so similarly with this, like one of the things I just recently watched, so somebody that I met when I was at DaveCon, he's another fellow YouTuber, David Johnson. He goes by DJ. And he recently just did an interview with Luke Gygax, Gary Gygax's son, one of his sons, and talking about Luke Gygax's recollections of playing through the giant modules, G1, Studying the Hill Giant Chief, and so on. And through the course of that interview, not only do you learn about what was happening, how they played at the time, and their play style, and how Gary ran the game for his kids, that was maybe a little different than he would have run it for other people, which again I think adds that kind of layer of complexity and humanity to somebody. But also Luke, he will intersperse his stories with like personal anecdotes about his dad. And it's just such a nice way to remind ourselves that these aren't, individuals whose, entire life can be encapsulated into a 280 character tweet about something that they said or did that we don't like, right? People are complex, and they need to be recognized as such. And so having, that video with Gary Gygax's son, Luke, who's also appears in here as well. And then Dave Arneson's daughter appearing in here and talking about them is just a reminder that we worship these guys or idolize them or whatever the word is, but sometimes we also feel this need for whatever reason to try to tear people down because of something that they did or said at one point that we don't agree with. And, I'm not saying that there's, people can't say things that are wrong and that we can call them out on it, but I think we should just recognize that they're more than those single things. Hopefully that makes sense. But with that, I want to get back to this. So I am super excited about this, as I mentioned. I will have a video on this, and I'm also going to put down links below. I can't remember if I mentioned this before. So I'm having to record this over 2 days. So it's Tuesday. When I started recording this, this was Monday the 10th. It's now Tuesday the 11th. But this is going on, I think it's pre-sale. I just got an email over the weekend, which was just funny because like 2 days later, or a day later, I got this in the mail, and I had talked to Griffith Morgan, who's the primary guy behind Secrets of Blackmore. So he offered to send this to me so I could talk about it on the channel here. So it's just so cool because there's just stuff in here that they're showing for essentially like the first time, like things that people have never seen before. So as you see this is the Blackmore campaign overview from Dave Arneson around March 1971. The other thing I really like about this, they never are specific about dates, circa March. It's around March of 1971. And as you go through this book, it talks about things like we don't always know what the dates are. And so the best thing that we can do is say it's this or this. Like there's a whole section in here. Well, there's a paragraph talking about how one of the players very specifically remembers playing the first Blackmore game over Christmas break in December of 1970, which is earlier than most people say, because if you look at the court documents, it says April 1971. And so you have this kind of disconnect. And then it just comes down to like you're relying on people's memory of something that happened over 50 years ago and, hoping that they can remember a specific date in time. And so anyway, it talks about that. But this is basically what you see here is Dave Arneson is writing about sort of this background of like what a Blackmore game is. And then they talk in here about how they're not exactly sure what this letter was for. It is unclear if it was meant as a letter specifically to Gary Gygax, or as a report for publication in the Castle and Crusade Society group, or as a campaign outline for the Blackmore players, which was also sent to Gygax. So I like that too. Like they just admit, we don't know what this is for, but we're sharing it with you. And it's really neat. And then one of the first, this is the Blackmore rough sketch map. And it talks about how, like, the Great Kingdom's here. So that the Great Kingdom, this was Gary Gygax's, nation, country, whatever you want to call it, that he ran in the Blackmore games. Okay, so that's where it was located. And then it talks about how it was probably a little bit off because Gary was explaining to Dave over the phone where it was, and Dave was trying to, make notes. And then it also says, I love this, Gygax never fully understood why Arneson would choose such a boggy and watery location in which to establish the Twin Cities war game campaign area. However, one must understand that Dave Arneson loved naval war games, so a campaign set in a place where rivers and marshy channels could be highways between the different cities which ships could navigate easily would lend itself handily to also conducting many naval battles. We know Dave Arneson was into naval games because, for one thing, he helped create Don't Give Up the Ship, but also he was working on a game before that that, from my understanding, was never actually published, but his ideas from that game ended up becoming the premise for saving throws in Dungeons and Dragons. So we've talked about that before. So all these cool maps, and then, more maps. Some of these, it talks about how they were in First Fantasy campaign, which I talked about earlier, except that these are, like slightly different versions. Okay, so which I think is kind of neat. There's a town map here. Again, I'm not showing you the whole book, but one of the things I love is this part, the Fletcher rendering of Blackmore. And so it says, during the 80s, Arneson briefly ran his own game company, Adventure Games. And it talks in here about how Dave Arneson didn't like the term role-playing games. He referred to them as adventure games. Calling it a role-playing game was not his idea. So that's why he named his company Adventure Games. But it says, of the many games produced by Adventure Games was it was a fantasy RPG titled Adventures in Fantasy, which was co-authored by Arneson and Richard Snyder. So Richard Snyder had worked at TSR back in the early 70s, after it was founded. And his brother John, Richard's brother John, was the creator of Star Probe and Star Empire. And then it was going to be a third part. It was supposed to be a 3-part series of games. And that third part, I forget what the name was going to be, but it was never published. And rather than publish that, TSR later then went on, got completely new designers rather than working with John Snyder, and they created Star Frontiers. But a lot of people think that the ideas in Star Frontiers, some of them at least, came out of the rough draft manuscript for this third, sequel game of the trilogy that was never published. But in any event, so Arneson had plans to publish a new updated version of Blackmore for use with Adventures in Fantasy, and his company goes out of business. So it goes on, and it talks about, this guy, Fletcher. Well, he ends up having access to all this stuff that, he just had in a drawer somewhere. And then he ended up sharing it with these folks. And so that's why a lot of this stuff has never been seen before. It's stuff that's decades and decades old about the foundations of creating Blackmore, but people just weren't aware of it. Or weren't aware of its existence, I should say. And then he gave it all over to the folks behind Secrets of Blackmore. It's called, they have a name, something of the Thing, Fellowship of the Thing, I think is what they call themselves. But in any event, sorry, I will try really hard to work on not saying that. It's just becoming too much of a crutch. But they worked on, or he shared this information with them, and then they're sharing it here. So some of Dave Arneson's notes from Corner of the Tabletop, the Spanish Royals character matrix. I have showed this before, but it's still cool to see it in here. So this is what I was talking about. The following documents are the newest discoveries we've made via Ken Fletcher's collection. They may also be the most astounding documents we've uncovered to date. There are 3 sets of writings by Arneson which reveal a great deal about how he saw his campaign early on, and in some instances give hints to the kind of rules that he may have been using for his games. And so this is awesome because it really gets into, like, you know, Dave Arneson, like his players, the Blackmore bunch, they say that like they didn't know what the rules were. Dave didn't share them with them, and like one of them in here, I forget which one, it might have been Graves Fenson. One of them talks about how like he saw his character sheet maybe twice the entire time that they were playing because it just wasn't needed for the way that Dave ran his games. So I think that's a lot of the problems where when you get Dave trying to, you know, Gary Gygax telling Dave or asking Dave, like, can you send me your rules for this game so that I can type them up and we can publish this game that's eventually going to become Dungeons and Dragons. Dave didn't necessarily have the rules in that style of format. And so I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from as to how much of a part Dave was of creating these games. You know, it's a whole other story. We can cover that another time. This is an illustration by Dave Arneson. So he was also an amateur illustrator. Okay, so this is really cool. So return to Blackmore, and it's so long on these, you know, typewritten pages, densely packed with text, where he's talking about the game. And he goes into things like, you know, the types of troops and stuff. So again, I have talked about that before, but that's kind of how he ran his game. See a guy here with obviously he had firearms. So big point of discussion as to whether you should have those in your games. I've covered that before in a video. Okay, so anyway, this is such an awesome thing. I am so thankful to the folks over there that sent this to me so that I could have a look at it. And again, I will, you know, cover that in a later video in more detail. But I would like to ask again if there's anything in here that you've seen so far that you'd like a closer look at and want me to spend more time on, so that you can, you know, we can delve into it together and talk about, like, you know, some specifics. Please let me know in the comments below, and I will try to, you know, make that happen if I can. So with that all being said, you know, while you're down in the comments, again, please join me on social media. I am pretty active there. Specifically, I'd say Twitter or X, if you want to call it that. Facebook, a little bit less on Instagram, and also Blue Sky. I'm trying to get that, you know, a little bit more active. I'm also, I have my blog. I'm trying to add more content to my blog. I know I keep saying that, but I have a whole backlog, for lack of a better term, of information that I am working to put onto the blog. And you can always support my shop, which I've talked about here before, with my t-shirts and hoodies, posters, mugs, etc. And again, thanks for your support on my Kickstarter. And if you haven't pledged yet, now is a great time to jump in before the Kickstarter is over, and then the prices, when it eventually goes on to DriveThruRPG, will be higher than they are now. So again, with all that said, please allow me to thank you so much for watching. Stay safe. Happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So I was having some beer. I got a few of these. My wife and I, a while back, visited Arrow Lodge Brewing Company, which is in Covina, California, so east of me. And this is their Buggin' Out Hazy IPA. So I used to drink a lot of beer. I'm sure probably compared to some of you, I still drink a lot, but I've actually cut back on my beer drinking. So I don't always like these tall cans like this because I'm not always in the mood to finish them all, but sometimes, you know, I can share them with folks, or quite honestly, with a hazy, I'll just put it back in the fridge. I know it's going to lose some of its carbonation. I'll put a cap over it. But I do like hazy IPAs quite a bit. So I go back and forth between them and West Coasts. It just kind of depends on my mood. This is a glass from a local pub by me called Lucky Baldwin's. They used to do these tastings every year for, well, they still do. Every February, they do a taste for Pliny the Younger. and they would sell tickets, and I would go with my friends, and we'd make a whole day out of it of, buying our tickets so we could taste this beer from Russian River Brewing Company. And this is a glass from one of those events from years ago. So cheers. Yeah, it's very, it's got that kind of citrusy, but like tropical kind of flavors to it. So I kind of like that style a lot. Okay. Anyway, what I was listening to was this classic record from 1967. It says Nina Simone Sings the Blues. So I was telling you how sometimes this company in the past, this is Vinyl Me Please, they used to put these cocktail recipes in here. So there was a bourbon milk punch, and I actually did make this at the time I was trying it out. I hadn't had a milk punch before, or at least not that I recalled, and it was a lot of fun, but it's not something I'm going to drink all the time. So I'm not a fan of like creamy drinks. I like clean, stirred and strong cocktails. So I'm mostly like a martini, a Manhattan, Negroni, Boulevardier, stuff like that. Nina Simone Sings the Blues, 1967. So this was her first record after she left her old record label. She came to this new one, and it's like a complete change in terms of the way that she was performing. So her previous record right before this one, as I recall, had like a full orchestra. It was like this really lushly produced album, very different style. This one is so much more raw. So she's on piano and singing, but she's backed up. There's two guitarists on here. Actually, you can see, and drums, bass, organ, and then this guy, Buddy Lucas, on harmonica and tenor sax. So, just some classic songs on here. So a lot of them written by her. Do I Move You? It's such a great way to start this album out. It's so, I'm going to say sultry as opposed to saying the word that first came to mind, but it's such a, it's a very powerful song about, her talking to her lover and asking, if she moves him, and the answer better be yes, please. that like to please her, that like he better say yes. And it's a really great song. But also, I'm a big fan of My Man's Gone Now. That's from the Porgy and Bess soundtrack. And she's got one of the definitive versions of that song. So it's a great song anyway, but just her performance is so great. And then House of the Rising Sun on here. So she had sung this originally years earlier, 1960, 61, 62, something like that. Nina at the Village Gate. It's a live album. And she sings that song. And then afterwards, the tune became popular from the cover by the Animals. So it's a traditional song. She didn't write the song, but the Animals covered it. And after their version became popular, she re-recorded it again, completely changed the orchestration. And it's a great cover of that song. And then I like I Want a Little Sugar in My Bowl as well. It's just, anyway, it's a great album. I'd say it's a good, you can listen to it anytime. I think it's a great kind of end of night album. Maybe sit back and with your loved one and kind of snuggle on the couch or whatever, have a fire going, put this record on, and just see where the night takes you. So anyway, thanks again for staying through the bonus content. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope, let me know if you've ever heard this album before, or if you give it a listen, if you like it. I try to showcase a lot of different styles, hoping maybe people discover something they've not heard of. I know a lot of my stuff is old, and I do that partially just because I feel like you all probably know all the modern music. So I'm trying to delve into stuff that maybe you just didn't grow up with, but can discover now. So thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the video as well. Please check out some of these other videos here and share them with your friends, and I will talk to you next time. Cheers.